Pronto. Olá a todos e todas e todes. Boa tarde. Em nome do Programa de Pós-Graduação em Estudos Comparados da Universidade de São Paulo, bem como da Universidade Estadual do Mato Grosso, da UERJ, Federal de São Carlos, Universidade de East Anglia, cujos participantes temos aqui hoje são muitas, eu sempre esqueço. Claro, né? Nossos dois projetos internacionais importantíssimos, né? Afroport, da Universidade de Lisboa, e o Intersexualidade, da Universidade do Porto, né? É da iniciativa desses grupos de trabalho e de pesquisa, né, que nós nos proporcionamos, né, uma tarde como essa. Quero dar minhas boas-vindas aos colegas Francisco Costa e Paulo Pepe, professor em East Anglia, na Inglaterra, e ao meu queridíssimo doutorando da Unesp. Eu esqueci da Unesp, que também é organizadora. Olha, Fernando Morais, né, autor de um livro importantíssimo, né, a Analítica Queer, recém-lançado, né, um aluno muito brilhante, né, e que vai nos dar coisas legais que nem nossos colegas aqui do lado. O Francisco vai ser visto daqui a pouquinho, né, na sua grande atuação. O Pepe eu já conheço, né? Lembrando sempre que essa atividade não é uma atividade que tenha surgido apenas das questões puramente acadêmicas, né? Mas ela nasce justamente dos afetos e do nosso querer estar juntos, né, durante a pandemia. Então, é um jeito da gente se encontrar. Eu agradeço muito ao Francisco e ao Paulo, né, pela iniciativa de estarem juntos nessa conosco, e dizer um bem-vindo também para o Fernando, né, em breve doutor, em breve entre os pares, né, onde ele sempre deveria ter estado. Um beijo para todos vocês.
Obrigado, Emerson. Boa tarde a todos. O meu nome é Paulo Pepe, sou professor da Universidade de East Anglia, aqui no Reino Unido. E vou então agora falar um bocadinho em inglês, visto que os nossos participantes de hoje vão apresentar as suas palestras em inglês. So now I'm going to start speaking in English. Good afternoon and welcome to the second round of Jornadas Interseccionais. First of all, I would like to say thank you to Professor Emerson Inácio and also to Professor Claudio Nigo for organizing this event. As Emerson has explained before, the aim of this gathering is to promote interaction and also scientific collaboration between Brazilian and foreign research who dedicate themselves to the fields that are related with race, ethnicity, gender, sexualities, queer and queer theories, considering that the interfaces with contemporary literary and cultural production. This event also intends to articulate national and international research groups, aiming to create dialogues capable of establishing the aesthetic and the political, and also with the social markers of difference, as well as demonstrating innovative approaches in the critical treatment of the literary texts. I also want to say, to take this opportunity to say thank you to both of my keynoters of today, Dr. Francisco Costa, who is an associate professor in humanities from University of East Anglia, and also to Fernando de Morais, who is a PhD research from the Universidade Estadual de São Paulo. Is that correct? And of course, I also want to say thank you for all of those who are watching from home. Thank you for being here today with us. I'm sure that you will enjoy it. So we will start now with Dr. Francisco Costa's talk, America as AIDS and Superman is Dead, AIDS, Mythologies and Politics of Embodiment, in 1990s America. Then we will continue with Fernando de Morais, who is going to be presenting on Dissonance and Resistance, the queer cry of Thomas Grimes. After these two presentations, we will have some time for questions and discussion. So thank you very much for being here today. And Dr. Costa, whenever you are ready, you can start now with your presentation.
Thank you, Paulo. Thank you. First of all, I would just like to thank everyone and thank Emerson and all the colleagues for organizing and inviting me to take part in this event today. So as Paulo said, the title of the paper I'll be presenting is America has AIDS and Superman is Dead, AIDS Mythologies and the Politics of Embodiment in 1990s America. Just to give a bit of a framing to what I'll be discussing. So I will primarily explore queer theatrical reconfigurations of superhero mythologies in the age of AIDS. So the analysis that I'll be here presenting will be set against a Canadian play, Brad Fraser's Poor Superman, which is from 1995. And we'll focus on its representation of bodily destruction in order to identify anxieties over the changing role of the body in gay male culture, both in the play and wider American-Canadian gay culture. I'll then go on to examine these anxieties against representations of bodily control and enhancement, namely the superheroic image of the transsexual, transgender, and the drag queen, who, as I will argue, should not be solely read as images of gender and sexual deconstruction, but instead as images of superheroic transformation. Now, to start this presentation, providing a bit of a framing around, why this focus on superheroes. So superhero narratives can serve as a powerful parallel for those who have to hide their secret identities. So seeing formidable versions of ourselves may indeed be an empowering fantasy. Feelings of impotence, and particularly of bodily disempowerment, then may be counteracted by fantasies of heroic bodily transformation. Such fantasies of power in the face of a considerable threat are likely to continue to have special significance. Indeed, our recent glut of superhero films, which you now see across, Marvel and DC and crossing lots of genres, may partially reflect this current urge in culture and wider global society. Superman, in particular, is very much associated with the mainstream of American politics, more specifically. The development of Superman's moral focus and force has proceeded just as one would have perhaps expected of such a nationalistic symbol. As America's geopolitical omnipotence has developed, so has that of its most popular hero. Tracing this development cinematically in Max and Dave Fletcher's original Superman cartoons from 1988, Superman's battle for truth and justice directs much of his time toward battling singular madmen, natural disasters, and dangerous technological advances. In terms of power, the hero begins famously faster than a speeding bullet, more powerful than a locomotive, able to leap tall buildings in a single bound. By Richard Donner's Superman in 1978, the Man of Steel is physically turning back the world, reversing time, and bringing the dead back to life. Superman has become a near unchallengeable, godlike figure. Scientifically, Superman is fighting not only for truth and justice by this stage, but also the American way. Superman's market trajectory was troubled, however, after the waning of interest in the film series of the late 70s and early 80s. In 1983, in the face of falling sales, DC decided that killing off Superman would garner much-needed publicity and revive flagging revenues for the original superhero. Some readers were taken in by this rouse, perhaps partially because, as we will see, it had etched itself to a mood of the times. New York University professor Herbert Landon was inconsolable the day after the son of Jor-El died. It is understandable that Superman must go. His assets were inconsistent with the era of moral ambiguity and androgynous sexual leanings. Superman is, after all, an anachronism, a model of bygone era when virtue mattered. Superman will be missed, but the virtue he embodied will be missed even more. Now, this conservatism now coupled with an apparent passion for the comic book narrative. But London may be mourning more than all the American superheroes. Superman was not the only world power in crisis during the 92-93 years. In the world of US politics, the Republican Party, after 12 years of Reaganomics, moralistic strictures on homosexuals and women, AIDS, apathy, and institutionalized racism, unexpectedly lost power to baby boomer lawyer Bill Clinton, who quite liked homosexuals and, as we discussed, really liked women. as we know, because of his story with Monica Lewinsky. Things may have looked bleak. Fortunately, however, just as Clinton was bombing his military inferiors and budgeting gay legislation in a matter of months, Superman rose from the dead 2 months later. The mythology of Superman stood for the American right, then as a metaphor for the apparent end of their unchallenged potency and the country's ideological shift towards the left. So this first part of the paper that I just took us through is just basically framing or discussing the interchangeable position of American politics with relation to Superman as a superheroic kind of identity. Now we'll take these to an American play of the time, which is Poor Superman, which takes these discussions and the context we are here considering into the impact of the AIDS crisis more specifically. Now, Brad Fraser's play, Poor Superman, on the other hand, makes quite a different use of the myth. Here we see concerns over the impact of the AIDS crisis on the heroic imagings of gay culture, rather than the feared end of unchecked homophobia and racism. And yet, the metaphor of Superman's death is used similarly in the sense that, it likewise denotes the challenge of certain myths of heroic power and hitherto unchallenged influence. The unfolding story of the Superman crisis of 92-93 stands as a parallel narrative metaphor for the oncoming crisis throughout the play, as Fraser sets up various subcultural superheroes and proceeds to test them to the point of crisis. When the fearsome preoperative transgender Shannon dies and her dream of gender reassignment is unfulfilled, when artist David's relationship with straight boy next door Matt comes to an end, when David realizes that his bathhouses and pill-popping lifestyle can no longer continue, when David's best friend, the journalist Kryla, realizes that her close but turbulent friendship with David is not necessarily compatible with the potentially misogynistic culture of gay homoeroticism and homosociability, Superman's death is announced. So this is a key moment in the play. Offered a comic book by Kryla in which Superman has returned, David declines. Superman may be back, but he will never be the same again. Preoperative transgender Shannon's death is part of David's learning as a representative of the wider gay male culture. But Shannon's death threatens the death of all gay fantasy, of gay superpower, of gay myth. The transgender outlaw is an archetype widely admired since the mythic events of the Stonewall riots, in the American context, standing generally as a repository of hope and faith in fantasy for gay subculture. As an ever-available discourse of empowering fantasy, its failure is a bad omen for queer dreaming. Most of all, the archetype represents faith in the body as a realizable site for the installation of fantasy, from the level of costume to surgery. Cross-dressing fantasy suggests that the body is a work of fantasy, a thing which can be willed into existence. Nietzsche's Superman similarly overcomes his human nature. Man, according to Nietzsche's alter ego Zarathustra, is a bridge and not a goal, sitting developmentally between the ape and the end goal of the Superman. This has the capacity to transform the drive to power over the world and other men into power over oneself. Nietzsche calls this an act of willing a self. And now here a brief quote. Active, successful natures act not according to the dictum know thyself, but as if there hovered before them the commandment will a self, and thou shalt become a self. Foucault and his intellectual heirs have foregrounded these ascesis, that is, the practice of cultivating, fashioning, and styling the self. And to imagine that queer subjects can heroically reinvent and self-reinforce is a broadly popular myth in gay culture. It is also, we might suggest, when critically damaged by AIDS. Pre-operative Shannon's need in Poor Superman to make the real of her body match her fantasy is clearly great for her. The fantasy, the non-material subjective imaging of a solid body she does not possess, is simply not enough. While her dink remains, quoting from the text, Shannon's fantasy cannot become sufficiently material, real, even if she managed to persuade others that this materiality is already effective. David, meanwhile, finds it impossible to comprehend this desire as he asks, why you are who you are, whether or not you've got a vagina. I love you no matter who you are. to which Shannon replies, "I am a woman." Now, poor Superman suggests a certain wistfulness for the old days when the body seemed to do exactly what we wanted. Shannon needs this final installation to make her feel like a woman. What Fraser makes clear is just how real the effects of fantasies of gender can be, not only for social relations, but within individual subjectivities. A discovery that she can never become a real woman is not a real woman, in quotes, is not made any better by Davies' suggestion that she is who she is, a facile voluntarist interpretation of the kind of paradigms that, for example, Judith Butler and Marjorie Garber describe. What interferes in Shannon's superheroic becoming, however, is AIDS, a kind of writing on the body which was impossible to undo, and hence somewhat difficult to resist. AIDS seems to bring an undeniable reality of some kinds of solid physical body back to the fore. For all that we might performatively install gender and sex, for all that we can make the insignia of gender and sex match our identities which construct our subjectivities, the disease does seem to radically curtail our ability to create the body to our own designs. Shannon's characterization of AIDS, microscopic things exploding like oranges on the subatomic level, cells being attacked, wars being declared, dark armies streaming out of my lymph nodes and into my bloodstream, recalls the galactic significance of the original death of Superman's home planet. Cities shatter, continents crack and heave, oceans boil, an entire planet, an entire culture being wiped out by some unforeseen, capricious trick of nature. The same war, which undoes the individual body, here of Shannon, has also undone an entire culture within the Superman mythology. Perhaps partially because individual bodies are inevitably involved in particular cultures, but also because, in the same way that Superman comes to diegetically represent the hopes of Kryptonian culture, for each individual, gay male heroic body had come to mythically represent gay male culture. For Fraser, Shannon's transsexual surgery represents a superheroic queer bodily empowerment, but this is far from the only superheroic corporeal construction in gay culture. There are marked similarities between transsexuals, transgender, and those superheroes who undergo bodily change at the level of the natural. Both have the fleshy physicality of their bodies overwritten by the discursive. While all the bodies are constituted by discourse, the superhero and the surgically enhanced transsexual work to demonstrate this constitutive process enacted upon flesh. While the drag queen appears to stop at the level of stylization on the surface of the body, a transsexual who chooses surgery carries on to inscribe the flesh itself. This flesh and skin remodeling is an effect of an initial citation, but paradoxically, it is simultaneously a refunctioning in order to produce that very citation. We can loop off a penis or fashion one from grafted tissue to produce the opposite sex that penis is imagined to signify. Discourse, fantasy makes the material. The material goes on to remake the discursive, and so forth. The transsexual body, even when it is finally resculpted, remains, of course, a work of fantasy, a recourse of some symbolic schema, both internal and collective. Marjorie Garber reports, for example, that poor cosmetic effects in mastectomies performed on male to female transsexuals are often ignored by their recipients. Newly mailed men tend to dance around with their tops off, even though they have significant scarring which others might consider embarrassing. This is, she argues, evidence that transsexual people regard their bodies theoretically. And this is correct, of course. We regard our bodies theoretically. We fantasize our bodies into existence. What we often need are certain props that make those fantasies seem more real. A mask, a cape, a utility belt, or a phalloplasty. But all bodily ritualizations, right down to the supposedly final inscriptions upon the flesh of phalloplasty or mastectomy, are theoretical citations, fantasies which remain fantasy even while they appear, through their permanency, through their surgically invasive nature, to become real. Thus, transsexualism implicitly acknowledges the constructivity of gender while demonstrating a yearning for the essential of the physical, fleshy body to match that construction. The material needs to match the discursive. The fantasy designed to supersede the flesh still needs to be enacted upon the flesh in order to be seen as the absolute real of the body. We should not imagine that superheroism is a narrative from which queer textual deployments in the early 90s sought only to challenge, to deconstruct, as in Fraser's Poor Superman. Rather, as I discuss here, there are various projects that either overtly utilize the superhero construct or at least manipulate parallels less antagonistically with this popular mythology. There are, as I have begun to demonstrate, significant points of congruence between the superhero and the transgender subject. The transsexual undergoes significant bodily transformations in order to achieve somehow, as Gilles St. Jacques observes, a significant signification of internal and subjective gender, just as superheroic experiments with gamma radiation bring out a previously hidden subject, for example, like Hulk, with uncontrollable rage and strength. Two major factors, however, connect the symbologies of the drag queen, the transsexual, and the superhero. First, these stand as figures who exist as points in a continuum of bodily transformation, predicted on an overt dialogue between the material of the body and the discursive of a certain abstract categorizations. I do not mean to highlight the differences between posited elsewhere between transsexuals and drag queens. The drag queen, as popularly conceived at least, is an impermanence performance which does not seek to pass, whereas a transsexual seeks exactly to be the opposite sex and enacts a permanent, or is suggested, deeper transformation. And yet, as we have seen, transsexual bodily alignments are still significations, no more real for their surgical manipulations of genitals than a drag queen's wig is a real demarcation of sex or gender. In terms of generic parallels, just as Batman's use of costume, technology, and physical training makes him no less of a superhero than Superman, with his Kryptonian atomic weight, or Spider-Man with his scientific bodily overwriting through the radioactive spider, both drag queens and trans embody, albeit at different points, a process, a performance of transformation. For all the critically foregrounded similarities, they are also very clear and important congruencies between the two. The trans and the superhero, we will return to the drag queen in a moment, embody a becoming which is somehow categorical. They are personifications of abstract with a strong cultural discursive pre-definition. Superheroic categorical becomings are clearly indexed by the naming process which generally follows superheroic transformations. Clark Kent becomes the category of super and Superman. Bruce Wayne becomes the category of Bat and hence Batman, and so on. Such superheroic becomings involve the stylizations of costume and often of the flesh of the body itself, through X-ray vision, climbing walls, and so on. These are fantasies of the discursive and the resultantly ideological reconstruction of the body, but they are also fantasies of individuals exceeding the bounds of individuality and singular subjecthood. Captain America, for example, is not satisfied with being simply American. Instead, he is genetically reconfigured to become this abstract concept of America or Americanism. Likewise, the trans, a subject engaged in the utopian process of straining toward an ideal gender, attempts to becomes not some sex or gendered individual, but rather the category of sex itself. I have so far concentrated on the trans and his congruencies with the superheroic, putting to one side the drag queen in these initial assertions. But I maintain that drag queen is similarly congruent with the cultural archetype of categorical becoming. What category then does a drag queen become? Unlike a trans individual, if theories are to be believed, drag does not strain toward an ideal of gender or sex or enact a categorical becoming of gender or sex, so much as it tests those ideals and those categories to deconstruction. As Ian Lucas summarizes, gender theories have suggested that, just trying to change the slide, the presentation of gender identity or allegiance becomes a point of contest, throwing into confusion binary categories so that the event itself becomes a crisis of binarism, challenging the accepted oppositional nature of gender. What then, I ask, is the categorical or absolute becoming of drag? The drag queen is a strong image, in a sense much like camp, but perhaps more than any other form. It makes visible the symbolic contradictions of homosexuality in a heteronormative world. Sadly, Munt's book Heroic Desire makes a case for the power of such constructions through the figure of the lesbian butch, and we might certainly draw certain parallels between the representational persona of the butch dyke and the drag queen. Most significantly, these body representations of the conflicts of homosexuality may be seen as the incarnation of the true homosexual, as Munt puts it. Hence, we might, I think, see the drag queen as a superheroic homosexual, a superheroic gay individual, the categorical becoming of queerness. For a mainstream audience, we might argue that drag queens, if not precisely Wonder Women, are ultimately queer men. As we have seen, for some in cross-dressing, there is a crisis of binarism, as Lucas presents it, challenging the accepted oppositional nature of gender. But for all that the drag queen represents some kind of confrontation with the opposite binaries, I think the evidence so far should make us question whether, in at least one dominant cultural framework, drag is a dissolution of binary genders. In one sense, drag may disrupt gender codes by refusal to align with a single gender, by adopting conflicting signals within the same body, and yet might also see drag as a revolution of those conflicts by its encompassing of those traits, those signals, in one identity within one singular subject. This encompassment and congruous resolution of oppositional forces may appear heroic, especially when those subjectivities are as harmoniously drawn. The heroic selves burst free, become cogent, independent, durable. As Munt observes of the lesbian butch, let me just change the slide. The butch reconstruction of the self is a reaction against the self-shattering violence of homophobia. The crafting of a new and bounded self, the butch displaces homophobia by erecting lines of force, which are simultaneously constituted by and a refusal of shame. This bounded identity is a result of specific social and psychic histories. The butch is a refounding of a fantasized hermetic self. Like the drag queen, the butch's apparently intersubjective yonking together of opposing gender signals can also somehow fashion a heroic self, as Munt would have it. The very amalgamation of opposites, of the discursive and the material, the body and the identity, the social and the individual, produce this seal-tight, robust, resilient subject, a kind of subjective hermesis which tends to characterize the heroic self into this one being which resists this violence of homophobia. Now, this brings me to my concluding paragraph after taking us through trans identities and drag as part of this creation of superheroic becomings. To conclude, superheroic identity, and more generally heroism, is a powerful and widely readable way of presenting social agency. The application of the strategies I have here presented, so the construction and representation of the trans and the drag queen as superheroic becomings, is a queer activist deployment that could indeed have a political use potential to exploit some kind of social cultural capital or mobilize some kind of social vector of power. By bringing the superheroic world into the mundanity of everyday reality, queers could indelibly establish how multiple, fluid, and fragmented gender and sexual identity is. And that brings me to the end of my talk. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Francisco, for your talk. We are now going to proceed with Fernando de Morais, and after that we will have some time for discussion after Fernando de Morais presents gives his talk. Okay, so Fernando de Morais, whenever you are ready, you can start. Okay.
Okay, thank you. So good afternoon. First of all, I would like to express my sincere gratitude to all the coordinators of this important event. Thank you also to Professors Paulo and Francisco. So I'll share my screen and then I'll start my presentation. Just a second. I'm having some problems, just a little second, and then I shall start.
Fernando,
Yes.
Conseguiu, entrou aqui.
Yes, got it. Thank you. So, I've entitled my talk, Dissonance and Resistance, the Queer Cry of Thomas Grimes. As Paulo has already introduced me, I am a PhD researcher. I'm still pursuing my PhD, and my doctoral advisor is Professor Claudia Nigro. Well, so I start by saying that I have recently read in a poem called Song of Myself by the influential American writer and poet Walt Whitman, an intriguing question whose overwhelming impulse still echoes in me. Do I contradict myself? Very well then, I contradict myself. I am large, I contain multitudes. These verses, whose resounding power has left indelible effects in me, bring to light, to a certain extent, a broader and therefore no less controversial theme, the identity, which has served as a support for immeasurable number of investigations. The approaches to this subject present such a diverse range of facets, and therefore its problematic has become more and more a frequent debate in the contemporary context. A matter of grave concerns and hot controversies, identity is under scrutiny. However, we are immediately driven against another imperative question: which, what kind, and whose identity are we talking about? Here, I am speaking specifically about queer identities, that is, the ones that contemplate the categories of gender, race, and class simultaneously. In this presentation, I begin by pointing out some criticisms toward queer theory's deployment in contemporary academic discourse, focusing on the absence of discourse on race and class within the queer theoretical paradigm. Next, based upon Johnson's analytical perspective, I offer a queer reading of two of Thomas Grimes' poems demonstrating how the intersection of race and gender operates in his work. Emerging in the 1990s, queer studies erupt as a transgressive gesture repudiating a logic centered upon cis-heteronormative models as well as upon regimes of the normal, previously adopted to describe something or someone odd or slightly off-kilter, and at a later time to stigmatize the deviants. Queer, then an aggressive and derogatory term, begins to be fervently claimed as a means of characterizing the insurgent activism not only against homophobia, but also against all other forms of oppression related to gender and sexuality. In proposing the opening of a space of destabilization, contestation, and subversion, and unsettling hegemonically foreseeable relations within the scope of the sex, gender, sexuality sequence, queer studies unfolds more as a political project than as a scientific current. Queer is a continuous disconcerting movement, or, as pointed out by Annie Marie Jaggos, a zone of possibilities always inflected by a sense of potentiality. In introduction to Keyword, Noreen Giffney's preamble to the Ashgate Research Companion to Queer Theory, the author makes the following observation. Queer is more often embraced to point to fluidity in identity, recognizing identity as a historically contingent and socially constructed fiction that prescribes and proscribes against certain feelings and actions. It signifies the messiness of identity, the fact that desire and thus the desire subjects cannot be placed into discrete identity categories, which remain static for the duration of people's lives. Queer thus denotes a resistance to identity categories or easy categorization, marking a disidentification from the rigidity with which identity categories continue to be enforced and from beliefs that such categories are immovable. Queer is championed by people both to reveal and revel in their differences in what Cherry Smith terms its potential for radical pluralism. It functions to designate a political persuasion which aggressively challenges hegemonies, exclusions, and assumptions. Despite the focus on the messiness and fluidity in identity and on its resistance to categorization mentioned above by Giffney, and also the productive epistemological and methodological potential present in queer theory itself, the contemporary use of the concept has been placed under suspicion. Queer is often said to operate as a conceptual shortcut or synonymous expression for gays and lesbians. Under the prism of the most severe reprimands, it is seen as an anything goes category or as an illegitimate unifying umbrella. One of the most trenchant criticisms leveled at gender studies, and particularly at queer theory, stems from its failure to recognize the correlations established between gender, race, ethnicity, and class. In the preface of the book In the Life, a Black gay anthology, released in 1986 and reissued in 2008, James Earl Hardy had already called attention to this carelessness. In a cultural milieu where Black was misrepresented by welfare queens and crack addicts, and gay was only discussed in the context of AIDS, and that face was a white one, there was little to no acknowledgement of the existence of people who were Black and gay. In the very same book, while addressing the non-recognition of and the invisibility of Black gay men within the communities to which they supposedly belong, Joseph Bean shows how these subjects are relegated to a condition of inferiority and indifference, urging us to pay attention to the fact that the racism and homophobia are versions of the same feeling, that of hatred. Vigorously opposed to this tyrannical logic, the result of a cis-heteronormative, white, supremacist, capitalist-driven patriarchy, the author announces that together we are making history. As Black gay men, we have always existed in the African-American community. We have been ministers, hairdressers, entertainers, sales clerks, civil rights activists, teachers, playwrights, trash collectors, dancers, government officials, choir masters, and dishwashers. You name it, we've done it, most often with scant recognition. We have mediated family disputes, cared for and reared our siblings, and housed our sick. We have performed many and varied important roles within our community. Together, we are creating and naming a new community while extending a hand to the one from which we've come. We are bringing into the light the lives which we have led in the shadows. Hardy's and Bean's concern seem to reverberate in Yvette Taylor's article, Queer But Classless, in which the author admits that queer theory has been accused of relegating materialities to the margins and raising sexuality to the level of most significant disruptive source of subversion. It should also be noted that transgender studies, in a similar vein, criticizes queer analytics. In the Subjugated Knowledges, an introduction to transgender studies, Susan Stryker argues the perpetuation of a homonormativity and of an antipathy or unthinking blindness by queer studies toward other expressions of queer difference. Transgender studies, according to Stryker, is in various respects more attentive to questions of embodiment and identity than to those of desire and sexuality. In this regard, we also directly touch upon the sphere of race, class, age, disability, and nationality within movements and communities organized around identity. Queer analytics seems incontrovertibly associated and galvanized around the values and concerns of white, gay, bisexual, lesbian, and transgender people, particularly young, middle-class or upper-class gay men. Such homogenization of identity, always already heterogeneous and manifold, leads to the danger of the single story to make use of the insightful expression by Nigerian writer Chimamanda Adichie. In the wake of these debates, writer and activist Darnell Moore even argues that African Americans are wanderers in the queer trajectory because our racial, ethnic, class, and social locations are ostensibly too quickly disregarded. It is almost as if our racial and other identities are queer in tint. That is, it seems that same gender-loving people of color are often subjugated to an unequivocal demand to contain our racial and other identities as the result of the enforced injunction on identity politics within the queer project. Moore is just one of the many scholars to point out critical insufficiencies as well as internal inconsistencies in the field of queer studies. Taking a deeper look, the maneuver, once again, is the silencing of voices and the exclusion of bodies, Black in this particular case, which the queer agenda in its origin vehemently rejected. Bringing these hesitations to light suggests a lack of completeness in this field of research, which fails queerly when subjected to a more rigorous scrutiny. Furthermore, queer theory elides the intellectual, aesthetic, and political commitment, significance, and expression of non-white, non-middle upper class gay, bisexual, lesbian, and transgender people in the endeavor to fight against lesbo, bi, trans, homophobia, and oppression. Attempting to fill this gap, E. Patrick Johnson, professor of performance studies and African American studies at Northwest University, United States, in a seminal article published in 2001 entitled Queer Studies or Almost Everything I Know About Queer Studies I Learned from My Grandmother, opens up a fertile and yet still little explored ground for the queer studies. The central text that lays the foundations of this field of study presents the definitions of the term queer as a dictionary entry. Queer, 1, meaning queer, also opposite of straight, odd or slightly off-kilter, from the African American vernacular for queer, sometimes homophobic in usage, but always denotes excess incapable of being contained within conventional categories of being, curiously equivalent to the Anglo-Irish and sometimes Black Irish variant of queer, as in Brandon Behan's famous play, The Queer Fellow. 2, a lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender person of color who loves other men or women sexually and or non-sexually and appreciates Black culture and community. 3, one who thinks and feels and acts and sometimes acts up, committed to struggle against all forms of oppression, racial, sexual, gender, class, religious, etc. 4, one from whom sexual and gender identities always already intersect with racial subjectivity. 5, queer is to queer as reading is to throw in shade. In a revisionist work which critically reads queer as queer, pronunciation of queer in the southern variation of African American vernacular English used by his grandmother, Johnson extends the boundaries and possibilities of the prototypical analytical and epistemological dimensions of queer studies in an effort to incorporate issues faced by lesbians, gays, bisexuals, and transgenders of color. As noted by the author, his grandmother's use of queer comprised two distinct meanings. One representing the use of queer, odd, irregular, slightly off-kilter, and the other represent an excess of meanings, both discursive and epistemological, based upon African American cultural traditions and experience. Johnson then states that his grandmother's knowledge, or the lack thereof, regarding the use of queer is ascribable to her multiple and complex social, historical, and cultural positionality. He also recognizes the absence of this specific cultural positionality in the recurring and more widespread use of queer, especially in the theoretical reappropriation of that term within the academic context. Therefore, aiming at substantiating the Black experience, Johnson intends to take a further yet risky step, postulating the reconceptualization of queer studies as queer studies, so that the categories such as race, ethnicity, and class, hitherto neglected, can be encompassed. By mobilizing the tensions raised between different identifying instances and carrying out a project whose main goal is an unrestricted inclusivity, Johnson claims the legitimation of a body politic that neither restricts identity to an invisible monolith predicated on an essentialist understanding of race, ethnicity, and gender, nor elides the materiality of the bodies, often converted into a site of trauma, where racist and or sexist and or trans-homophobic coercion and violence operate. The poem Equations by Thomas Grimes is a clear example of the presence of such bodies upon which hostilities are perpetrated. Equations. Asking me if I'm Black before being gay or gay who just happens to be Black is the same as asking about chickens and eggs. Whatever came first is irrelevant. There are no common denominators. Theoretically speaking, I am not to be defined by some simple equation. I am not to be added up, subtracted, multiplied, and divided by Afro and homocentricities. Nor am I to be fractionalized, calculated, and rounded off by a square as ruled. I carry my own self over to the first power of just being me. The speaker, in a vigorous process of escape from taxonomy, pleads through his discourse to render invalid the need for adjustment to the inflexible and methodical rules agreed and deliberated by another, presumably occupying a dominant hierarchical position. Here, the discursive power operating in the production of specific types of subjects is called into question. This attempted imposition of identity by the other or by different institutions suppresses or hinders the possibility of the individual to speak for himself, reinventing, rewriting his history. In this logic, the subjects do not speak for themselves, but are spoken for and about. They are objects of discourse, not participants in it. Grimes' proposal is to convulse this understanding. If the Black gay body in the historical trajectory, and also in literature, has been violated in its integrity, served as a territory of subjugation, prevented from speaking for itself, in the project of such poet, it gains new contours and qualifies as a political field of self-sufficiency. By denying common denominators rather than specifying a fixed identity, the opportune thing, as Grimes demonstrates, is to reflect upon the processes of its production with the purpose of invalidating meta-narratives, cutting across borders, reporting intolerances, and undermining exclusions. In this regard, we perceive the poet's literary maneuver, which, by addressing his own experience and corporeality as a Black gay man, rescues a feeling that is both private and collective, and reproduces it in writing. This writing of the body, therefore, elaborates in order to destabilize racist and homophobic stereotypes, transmutes itself into a political instrument that jeopardizes hegemonic thoughts and discourses. In My Gay Problem, Your Black Problem, an article from the book The Greatest Taboo, Homosexuality in Black Communities, Earl Hutchinson comments that Black gay men continue to feel like men without the people. They carry the triple burden of being Black, male, and gay. They are rejected by many Blacks and sense that they are only barely tolerated by white gays. Many Black gay men feel trapped, tormented, and confused by its quandary. They still spend sleepless nights and endless days figuring out ways to repress, hide, and deny their sexuality from family members, friends, and society. Under this logic, Black gay bodies come across as being of no importance, of no worth, reinforcing stigmas and stereotypes. The ideal of white beauty, conditioned by such a powerful and long-established discourse, is interjected into the consciousness of Black people, so these subjects accept it and perceive it as natural. Grimes, however, presents the significance of such a body on the menu. I like my lovers the way I like my coffee, Black with lots of sugar. I like freshly squeezed hugs in the morning, kisses that taste of oranges. I like my toast buttered on both sides with lots of jelly and jam between sweet rolls. I like sausage over bacon, and I prefer it hot, juicy, well done, and tender. I like my eggs hard, boiled that is. Over easy was never my thing. I like breakfast in bed because it's the only way to get down to the real true grit. The poem reveals itself as an erotic composition of recognition of the other, whose body, Black with lots of sugar, is contemplated and celebrated. The roles are reversed. The Black man is placed in a positive condition as object of the desire, unveiling a disturbing logic of prejudice inflated by the dominant white heteronormative matrix. As a result, Black corporeality transgresses both erasure and silence, acquiring new meanings, unfolding not as ordinary, vulgar materiality, but rather as a determining catalyst for values that contradict normative standards. Accordingly, it is essential to point out the construction of the other from a locus of enunciation alien to the Eurocentric and hegemonic perspectives as a way of unsettling the unsavory stereotypes which lie heavy on Black bodies' aesthetics. Thus, the threads of an unparalleled aesthetics are intertwined in order to challenge discourses instituted under the aegis of racism, classism, delegitimization, dehumanization. As far as we can understand, the Black gay body matters, signifies being converted into a site of desire and pleasure. An inattentive reading, however, would lead us to think of a process of objectification and sexualization of such body. Nonetheless, knowing Grimes' consistent record of militancy, his struggles run in the opposite direction. The author, rejecting the domestication and discipline of bodies, put forth an intersectional proposition in which Black gay men come into view as a point of diffusion of positive characteristics. Thus, the queer body is portrayed in its full majesty. For being entangled and complexified, given that they simultaneously comprise the signs of subordination imposed by force of racial, class, and gender prejudice, as well as the structuring pressures of a colonial matrix of power, a myriad of identities and subjectives remain outside queer theory's purview. Criticizing the limitations and insufficiencies of this theory, Johnson argues that because it focuses mainly on notions such as selfhood, agency, and experience, it is invariably not equipped to accommodate intersectional issues in which race, ethnicity, gender, and class roots intertwine. The author elucidates that queer, on the other hand, not only speaks across identities, it articulates identities as well. queer offers a way to critique stable notions of identity and, at the same time, to locate racialized and class knowledges. My project is one of recapitulation and recuperation. I want to maintain the inclusivity and playful spirit of queer that animates much of queer theory, but I also want to jettison its homogenizing tendencies. As a disciplinary expansion, then I wish to queer such that ways of knowing are viewed both as discursively mediated and historically situated and materiality conditioned. This reconceptualization foregrounds the ways in which lesbians, bisexuals, gays, and transgender people of color come to sexual and racial knowledge. Moreover, queer studies acknowledges the different standpoints found among lesbians, bisexuals, gays, and transgender people of color, differences that are also conditioned by class and gender. Within the analytical framework of queer studies, discourse and body are not assumed as mutually exclusive terrains. Thus, Johnson recommends the maintenance of a dialectic relationship between these two instances and advocates the non-interpretation of the body experience as anti-intellectual. By seeking an epistemology predicated on the body, the critical gap between theory and practice is reduced. Although queer studies is a generous point of origin from which the theorization of gender and sexuality has advanced at a rapid pace, they are inadequate and defective in dealing with categories of subjects whose racial, ethnic, and class identities, among so many others, are in transit and in constant intersection. It is therefore from this pressing need that queer studies unfolded as an interventionist disciplinary project. Actively engaged both in the politics of difference and in the politics of racism, it opens up as a territory where the so-called abject or underclass subjects can celebrate their continually transient identities. To finish my exposition, I would like to make use of Johnson's voice that brings us some encouragement and in some way inspires us to resist. While attending to discursive fields of knowledge, queer studies is also committed to theorizing the practice of everyday life. Because we exist in discursive as well as material bodies, we need a theory that speaks to that reality. Indeed, queer studies may breathe new life into our dead or deadly stratagems of survival. And these are my references, and I should say thank you.
Thank you, Fernando de Morais, for your presentation. And also thank you to Francisco for your presentation. And now we are going to have some discussion about your presentation. So if there is any questions that someone wants to ask, can ask now questions. The questions can be either in English or in Portuguese, because both of them, they do speak in Portuguese. So if you want, I can speak in Portuguese now. Se vocês quiserem fazer então perguntas agora em português, podem fazer perguntas em português. Ou se há alguém que quiser fazer uma pergunta em inglês, também pode fazer uma pergunta em inglês. Ok, eu tenho alguns comentários que eu gostaria de começar. Eu vou começar com o professor Francisco. Professor Francisco, podia falar mais sobre a importância destas transformações físicas que as pessoas tinham para se tornar um super-herói?
A ideia... como é que eu posso dizer? A proposta do texto que eu estou a analisar e que analiso aqui neste paper, a ideia é toda à volta do sentido de apresentar a figura da drag queen e da figura do transgender enquanto, desculpem pela interferência do inglês, enquanto uma figura super-heroica. E é no sentido de ligar a transição, o facto de passar por este período de transformação, a transformar-se na sua própria identidade, naquilo que é visto como a sua identidade discursiva, real, em uma forma física. E é tudo através de estabelecer essa ligação. E depois eu utilizo, neste caso, no paper que apresentei, a peça do Poor Superman, que é uma peça em que temos uma figura que é trans e ela está a querer transicionar, mas, no entanto, por causa do vírus AIDS e tudo mais, é uma coisa que impede chegar a essa realização e conseguir completar essa transformação. Então, basicamente, a forma como o paper foi estruturado e como o apresentei, como é aqui discutido, é no sentido de estabelecer esta ligação entre algo que é mainstream, que é super-heróis, que é algo que consumimos e cada vez mais vemos por todo lado, no cinema, na televisão e tudo mais, e de forma a aplicar e de certa forma subverter isso com base nas identidades que nós atualmente não vemos tão presentes em filmes de super-heróis, e que na realidade elas próprias, este tipo de identidades que passam por este tipo de transformações, são elas próprias identidades de super-heróis, super-heroínas, super-heróis e tudo mais. E é por aí, acho que é por aí.
Está bem, obrigado. Tinha mais uma pergunta para lhe fazer sobre a sua comunicação, que é: por que você acha que a sociedade americana se encontra tão focada no falo e na masculinidade dos super-heróis?
Eu acho que é mesmo os super-heróis são vistos de uma forma quase como um projeto nacionalista, em que temos todas estas figuras que representam a grandeza da América e o que significa ser americano. Por isso é que temos a figura, por exemplo, do Capitão América, do Super-Homem. Eles todos são super-heróis no sentido que eles representam, que eles refletem, que eles são um encapsulamento do que é que significa ser americano. E normalmente são sempre associados com esses conceitos de verdade, de justiça, dessas ideias que são bastante americanas e que na realidade não são uma reflexão real do que é americano. Por isso, até em termos de uma perspectiva global, ao termos estes heróis e estes tipos de construções heroicas transportadas para o resto do globo, passar esta imagem da América e desta ideologia do que é ser americano e do que é a América, e vemos que é algo que faz muito sucesso a nível global. Mesmo
sim. Isso é um ponto muito interessante do que você agora mencionou, da questão do americano ser o super-herói que tem que lutar contra o resto, em que parece que só os americanos é que têm poder de justiça, enquanto que o resto não tem visibilidade, não tem voz, não tem o mesmo estatuto a nível de herói, porque outra vez liga com a questão do nacionalismo americano que você mencionou agora.
E nós vemos isso, por exemplo, essa mesma postura é uma coisa mesmo dos americanos, da sociedade americana, e a forma como o discurso nacionalista americano é construído toda à volta dessa imagem quase de serem the chosen ones, porque o papel intervencionista que a América tem sempre em todas as guerras a nível internacional e de meter sempre em assuntos no Médio Oriente, por exemplo, em coisas que não são diretamente relacionadas com eles, ou participar em crises políticas noutros países, de uma forma ou de outra, é mesmo quase parte desse discurso nacional, de sentir-se que temos que intervir, e é essa parte dessa mitologia toda que é construída à volta da América.
Da América. Muito obrigado. Obrigado, professor Francisco. Fernando, eu tinha que lhe falar sobre a questão de queer, na questão porque eu estava a pensar na questão de queer, porque num dos módulos que eu estou aqui a lecionar na universidade, foca-se bastante na questão de o que é queer e como é que o queer pode ser representado e o que é que significa, quais são estas identidades. E numa das minhas primeiras aulas em que eu estava a falar com os meus alunos, em que estávamos a discutir sobre a questão do que é queer, muitos dos meus alunos achavam que queer é só sobre gays e lésbicas, que é aquela umbrella, aquele guarda-chuva, como você falou na apresentação. E achei bastante interessante como você também posicionou o termo queer em relativamente a outras identidades, como, por exemplo, a pessoas com deficiências e questões de outras identidades. Por isso, gostaria de saber se o Fernando de Morais tinha qualquer coisa mais a dizer sobre isto. Porque é que você acha que, por exemplo, queer às vezes é tão limitado, é visto como sendo tão limitado relativamente a estas categorias? Não sei se tem alguma opinião relacionada a isso, porque eu sei que o Fernando depois vai para o queer, em que o queer é mais...
Sim. Na verdade, quando eu comecei a pensar em relação ao queer, depois eu li o texto do Johnson, que foi quem deu o pontapé inicial na teoria queer, me chama bastante atenção, porque uma das coisas que as pessoas têm a tendência a pensar, de fato, é que a teoria queer, ou, enfim, os estudos queer, eles são sinônimos de estudos gays e lésbicos. Isso muitos autores já disseram que não, porque, na verdade, quando a gente pensa lá nos anos 80, mais ou menos, né, quando esses estudos gays lésbicos estavam no auge, né, existia ainda um processo muito grande de assimilação. Então, não se discutia, nesse momento, o que era, por exemplo, e não se fazia nenhuma crítica em relação ao que era a heterossexualidade. As pessoas eram impingidas enfim, os dissidentes sexuais eram impingidos a engolir o que era essa heterossexualidade. Se eles quisessem ser presentes de alguma forma na sociedade ou reconhecidos, eles teriam que seguir aquele modelo pré-estabelecido. Quando vem a teoria, quando vem a analítica queer lá no começo dos anos 90, o que se começa a questionar olha, se o que a gente entende como sendo gênero e sexo é algo que é discursivamente construído e também historicamente construído, a gente precisa pensar que não é só a homossexualidade que é construída dessa forma, mas também a heterossexualidade o é, né? E aí, então, começa a ter essas discussões que não quer exatamente uma assimilação por parte dos dissidentes, mas é justamente o oposto, é o reconhecimento dessas diferenças. Então, a partir daí, a gente consegue pensar que não dá para falar que os dois tipos de estudos lésbicos e gays, são sinônimos de teoria queer, mesmo porque a teoria queer avança muito em relação a isso, e não é simplesmente um estudo que está para falar ali das questões de gênero, né? Qualquer coisa que a gente faça, que a gente tenha essa postura de contestação, de alguma forma, a teoria queer, né? E depois o queer já faz uma releitura, na verdade, uma crítica e uma releitura em relação a isso, para englobar outras categorias, né? Categorias de raça, de classe e outras mais que a gente poderia colocar.
Sim. Outra coisa que eu achei importante que você mencionou foi sobre a questão da questão dos homens negros e dos gays e da SIDA, deles serem invisíveis. E eu gostaria de falar um bocadinho mais sobre isso com você, Fernando, porque achei esse tópico bastante importante, por causa da questão de que existe mais do que uma marginalização relativamente, não é só sobre a sexualidade, mas agora também a raça, se calhar também até acaba por ser com a classe social, muitas vezes. E depois tem a questão toda da SIDA, que ainda torna os mais invisíveis. Só eu gostaria que o Fernando se pudesse falar um bocadinho mais sobre esta questão.
Então, na verdade, aí a gente já passa a pensar na questão das interseccionalidades, né, como a Kimberly Crenshaw vai dizendo. Então, todos os sujeitos, né, todos os indivíduos, eles são cruzados por eixos de opressão. Então, a gente sempre pensa, né, que quem está no topo dessa pirâmide, né, quem é o mais privilegiado, é o homem branco, cis heterossexual, de classe média ou alta. E tudo aquilo que não se configura como esse padrão, né, que é pré-estabelecido, vai sofrer uma série de opressões, e quanto mais distante desse topo da pirâmide o indivíduo se encontra, mais opressão ele vai sofrer. Né? Então, a gente pensa na questão, por exemplo, do indivíduo que é dissidente sexual. Se o indivíduo é dissidente sexual, mas é branco, ou pertence à classe alta, ele não é tão estigmatizado, por exemplo, é lógico que é estigmatizado, mas o que eu quero dizer é que não é tão estigmatizado como se fosse um homem negro naquela mesma situação, ou então uma lésbica negra, ou então uma pessoa trans negra, ou uma travesti negra, ou enfim, de outras raças, né? Estou usando o negro aqui como parâmetro, mas poderia ser quaisquer outras raças que não a raça branca, né? E ainda quando eu gostei muito quando o Paulo falou, o professor Paulo comentou sobre a AIDS como algo que é escrito no corpo, né? Então, quanto mais escritas no corpo esse sujeito tem, né? De alguma forma ele vai ser mais oprimido, né? Dentro desse padrão que a sociedade cria. Então, a gente consegue perceber essas coisas pelos vetores da interseccionalidade, né? Então, eu penso que, então, nesse caso, quando essa questão da AIDS, né, inscrita no corpo do sujeito, existe uma invisibilização ainda maior, né? Porque, além de todos os outros eixos de opressão, ainda tem o eixo de opressão em relação à doença, né?
Sim, e eu estava até a lembrar-me do documentário Paris is Burning, de 1990, em que também aborda essa questão toda daqueles bailes que havia na sociedade americana, que não é o mainstream, é underground, e que também debate sobre essas questões todas de raças e de sexualidade, é bastante mais oportuno e se relaciona de uma certa forma com aquilo que o Fernando estava a dizer agora, não é? Que parece que existe aquela questão toda de que acabam por ser cada vez mais marginalizados por causa destas multiplicidades de identidades que existem nos corpos deles. Não sei se haverá mais alguém que quiser fazer algum comentário, alguma pergunta aos nossos...
Eu queria fazer uma intervenção rapidinho, assim, eu achei uma coisa muito interessante no que o professor Paulo tinha colocado a respeito dessas identidades escondidas, né? Eu não sei se, de repente, no seu trabalho, Paulo, você abordou isso de alguma forma, mas daria para fazer um paralelo, penso, não sei, posso estar falando bobagem também, um paralelo entre essa questão do sujeito no armário, né, e as identidades secretas. Não sei se você chegou a abordar isso na sua análise, mas talvez é uma outra linha de pensamento, assim, que daria para desenvolver.
Não pensei nisso. Mas sim, é a questão de que dentro do armário existe muitas peças de roupa, não é? Como igual a muitas identidades dentro deste armário.
Sim, na verdade, eu falei Paulo, mas na verdade era para Francisco, né? Francisco falou sobre a... Desculpa, professor Francisco.
Não,
mas é isso. Eu no início falo brevemente sobre isso, mas é a ideia de pessoas que são normalmente oprimidas, que são questões sexuais, têm tendências sexuais, o que é que seja, têm essa identidade por uma razão ou outra dentro do armário como identidades secretas, e é o paralelo com a questão dos super-heróis, em que nós apenas podemos revelar essa nossa identidade se estivermos num espaço em que nos sentimos seguros para revelar essa identidade, para mostrar quem realmente somos, senão temos que mostrar aquilo de quem somos, como por exemplo com o super-homem ser o Clark Kent e depois ser o super-homem, e é nesse sentido, é quase. O Clark Kent é a representação do armário e o super-homem é a verdadeira pessoa que ele é. Exato, mas é muito interessante. Não, eu achei também a questão toda porque essa questão toda de queer studies e da interseccionalidade, assim, eu acho que é mesmo a direção, o futuro de queer studies tem que ser por aí, não pode ser só focar-se naquilo que se focou durante a primeira década, ou quando falámos dos anos 90 até essa altura, e agora acho que é mesmo importante pensarmos não só num contexto, por exemplo, eu fiquei num contexto americano, então isso foi no contexto americano, mas pensar como é que estas análises que nós fazemos e que estamos a fazer têm um impacto ou são refletidas de uma forma completamente diferente noutra parte do mundo onde as coisas são completamente diferentes. E no início, quando o Queer Studies começou e a teoria queer se estabeleceu como uma área de estudo, acho que havia este foco muito grande na experiência europeia e americana e westernized, de certa forma. E acho que é importante que o discurso mude de direção também, para ter em conta muitas outras identidades que não se encaixam naquilo que tem sido estudado até agora.
Sim.
E é por isso que eu acho que a sua intervenção é muito importante nesse sentido, em considerar outras coisas para além daquilo que está mais do que dito, que está mais do que falado e que nós já sabemos o que é.
E tem a questão desse lapso temporal também, porque, por exemplo, o artigo do Johnson é de 2001, isso aí, essa teoria, né, essa analítica que eu gosto de chamar, só chega agora no Brasil em 2017, quando eu comecei a trabalhar com essas questões. Então, assim, tem um lapso de no mínimo 16 anos aí, né? Então, essas coisas, elas produzem efeitos mais a longo prazo, né?
É a mesma coisa em Portugal, nós experienciamos a mesma coisa em Portugal também, em que muitas das coisas deste tipo de conversas e discursos e investigação chega muito mais tarde e tem mesmo a ver também um bocadinho com um certo elitismo da academia americana e da academia inglesa, de o que é que está escrito em inglês e de limitar um bocadinho o acesso a este tipo de discurso.
Desligaste o microfone.
É importante ter investigadores como o Fernando no Brasil a fazer investigação sobre este assunto e a trazer essa investigação para o contexto brasileiro. Isso é muito, muito importante.
Não sei se haverá alguém que, entretanto, quer participar desta discussão. Penso que não. Temos aqui o comentário do Carlos Eduardo, a dar-vos os parabéns. Pronto, então, vamos então encerrar a nossa mesa. Desde já, mais uma vez, muito obrigado ao Fernando e ao Francisco pelas vossas apresentações hoje. Também queria agradecer outra vez ao Emerson e à Cláudia que não estão aqui hoje presentes agora. Não hoje, sim. E também gostaria, acho que a próxima mesa vai ser em 2 semanas, se não estou em erro. Salviano. Alguém me sabe dizer quando é que vai ser a próxima mesa? Acho que já não tenho a certeza quando é que ia ser. Mas pronto, podem ver através da divulgação nas redes sociais e também nos estudos comparados pós-estudos comparados da USP. Provavelmente haverá mais informação de quando é que vai ser a próximas palestras. Mais uma vez, muito obrigado a todos por estarem aqui presentes. Desejo-vos o resto de um bom dia. Para nós já é de noite aqui. Isso, obrigado.
Obrigado a todos. Muito
Eu
obrigado.
estou a dizer que a próxima semana, dia 3 de dezembro, às 6 horas de Brasília, e vai ser sobre gênero e nação. Obrigado, Mário. Obrigado. Pronto, então, concluímos então assim a nossa mesa hoje. Mais uma vez, obrigado. Tchau, tchau a todos.
Deus, obrigado.
Obrigado, tchau.